Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of Bass Fishing Declassified, where we do a deep dive into the world of bluegill bed fishing, one of the best summer patterns you can do for numbers of bass and big bass. Let's go. So bluegill beds are one of the best summertime patterns that you can use to catch big bass. After the bass are finished spawning, they start moving off. The bluegill move into a lot of those same areas that bass spawned in. You know, they're going to be looking for gravelly type areas, your pea gravel, your sand. The same areas that you found bass spawning are going to be areas that the bluegill use as well. So really what you're talking about is the time period from May, once the water temperature gets up around that 70-degree range, all the way through the rest of summer until the water temperature starts cooling off towards the end of August. So you've got 3 months of prime bluegill bed fishing. And you have these periods where you'll have a wave come in and then you have a wave go out. So it's not like you've got just one simple bluegill bed that's there for a couple of weeks. A lot of times you have new waves of bluegills that come in, use the same honeycomb, and then move out and a fresh batch moves in. So when you're looking for these bluegill beds, it's really pretty easy to identify them. First, you can use your eyes. You know, you can get on the trolling motor, cover a ton of water, and you'll see these honeycombs. But more importantly, there are specific areas that you should concentrate your time. Once you've, depending on what type of lake you're on, if you're on a highland impoundment, you've got these big rocky banks. The bluegill aren't generally going to spawn on big 45-degree banks or big chunk rock or bluff banks. They're generally going to move into some of those calm bays where you've got some more of that pea gravel, you've got rock transition into a sand bank. But some of the key areas on the highland impoundments to look for are small coves like this, where you have kind of steep banks at the mouth of the cove, but as you get towards the back, it really starts to silt in with sand from runoff that comes in from heavy rains. And what that does is it creates a flat in the back of the cove. The bluegill will get on those and they will create honeycombs. So those are really good places to start with your search. And another key place to look is behind docks, and specifically marina docks. These are generally going to be in more protected areas, and the bluegill like to get behind them because you have good protection from strong wave action, and they're going to be in those protected areas that have a lot of sunlight and that those bluegills will need to use to lay their eggs and have their eggs successfully hatch. If you're fishing a lowland impoundment where you've got much flatter banks, those are going to be similar type areas that you're going to look as the highland impoundments, but a lot of times you'll find that the bluegill beds are much more offshore. So instead of going right down the bank, you know, where you're going to see bluegill beds 15 or 20 feet off the bank, you might have to start looking 100 yards offshore. You've got a lot more of those larger bays that are much shallower, where you've got a bunch of high spots within the bays. Those are going to be key areas to look. So the keys here is you're going to be looking for protected areas that have warm water and hard bottom. And by hard bottom, again, I'm not talking about rock. I'm talking about like hard packed sand, your shell, your pea gravel, things that the bluegills can rub away to create their crater to lay their eggs in. If you happen to be up in the North Country, again, they're going to be looking for sand, they're going to be looking for pea gravel. Those are the main areas to concentrate on. You're still looking for the protected areas, and a lot of times if you've got good weed growth, they will be between the shoreline and the inside of that weed line. Those are really good places to look. If you happen to be on a body of water that does not have clear enough water where you can physically see the bluegill beds, then you can find them using your electronics, whether that's your side scanning imagery or your 360. And even with forward-facing sonar, you can identify bluegill beds with all of those. So you can simply, you know, idle along those same areas that you normally would be looking with your eyes in clear water, and you can graph it. It comes through really clean.
Really quick, if you guys enjoy the content in this video and want more personalized instruction, head to our website, fishthemoment.com. Then go to the virtual lessons page. Here you can book one-on-one virtual lessons with each member of the Fish the Moment team. In these 1-hour lessons, the Fish the Moment team member will break down your lake using Google Earth and a contour line map and answer any questions you have. Whether you're preparing for an upcoming fishing tournament or a fun weekend on the lake, make sure you sign up for one of these one-on-one virtual lessons so you're fully prepared to catch as many fish as possible on the water. Check them out at fishthemoment.com.
So once you've identified the bluegill beds that you want to target, The next biggest key is to determine whether or not there's bass that are using those. Now, if you can physically see those bluegill beds, if you can see it out there, a lot of times you'll see the bass that are cruising around them. So you know that there's bass that are trying to eat those bluegill beds and they're using that area as a place to feed. Now, you don't always have that though. Like I said, if you can't see the bluegill bed colony, you're not going to be able to see the bass there. The key here is, regardless of water clarity, the bass are going to set up in similar manners. If you have an actively feeding bass, they will be on that bluegill bed. They will be actively seeking out a bluegill to eat, so they'll be swimming through it. Generally speaking, you don't find that many bass that are actively feeding on the bluegill bed. They have feeding windows throughout the day, so it's not like they're just running around when you get up there. They're usually going to be sitting either right on the edge of the bluegill bed, waiting for an opportunity for one of those bluegills to screw up, make a mistake. They take advantage of it and they eat the bluegill. So they're either going to be sitting on the edge or they're going to be sitting around targets that are around that bluegill bed. This is probably one of the most important things to be successful when bluegill bed fishing, is to identify the targets. Those targets could be various things. It could be a clump of weeds, it could be a clump of lily pads, it could be the nearby dock, a nearby stump, a brush pile. It really could be almost anything, but you got to remember the bass are going to want to use a piece of structure as a place to sit and ambush a bluegill that makes a mistake. Here are my top 3 ambush points that the bass are going to use day in and day out across the country. Number 1 is a dock. If you have a dock that's nearby to that bluegill bed, they will set up in the shade lines, around the posts, around the dock supports, and around floats. Generally speaking, they will be on the shallow side of that dock though. They're not going to be out hovering over the deepest part of the dock unless you're in shallow water and the bluegill beds extend out to that point. But if you're on a dock that sits over 30 feet of water and the bluegill bed's within 15 feet of the bank, those bass are going to use the closest point to that bluegill bed as their ambush point. And don't forget dock cables. If you're on a lake like a highland impoundment that's got a lot of floating docks and you have cable support lines, they'll sit on those cable support lines as well. So the docks are, without a doubt, one of the best places for the bass to set up and target those bluegill. The next is just a lay down tree or a small piece of brush or a piece of wood that's really close. It could even be a stump. A lot of times you'll have, in the same areas where those bluegill are spawning, you'll have a lay down tree or a small brush pile or a small flooded bush. The bass love to sit within those pieces of structure to ambush the bluegill. And the last is one that you may not recognize right off the bat, and it's simply a shade line. So if you've got a pocket where the bluegill are exposed to the sun, which is what they're usually going to be because they need that sunlight for their eggs to hatch, a lot of times, depending on the sun condition, you'll get shade lines that come down from nearby trees or bushes that are surrounding that cove or that pocket that the bluegills are in. The bass will sit in that shade line to wait to ambush those bluegill. Those are 3 high percentage spots, but guys, if you've got any other piece of structure that's in or around the area that the bluegill beds are setting up, make sure you pay attention to those because there's a high percentage chance that the bass will be using them as well. There's a lot of good bait choices that you can use to effectively fish bluegill beds successfully. For me, it comes down to a couple of different categories. The first, and potentially my favorite, is a topwater. The topwater category is probably the best bait that mimics a feeding bluegill. In my opinion, a popper like this Magnum Pop-R is one of the best choices. And really what happens here is you have a bait that's sitting on the surface, not moving, which is very similar to how a bluegill feeds. If you've ever heard a bluegill suck a bug off the surface, they create a popping sound when they do that. Very similar to a popper like this Pop-R or any other popper that you want to use. Another key with this bait that I do is I'll replace the tail with a flashabou skirt on the back treble hook. And the reason I do that is because the flashabou, in my opinion, mimics a bluegill tail better than anything else. Now, I think feathers are good as well, but the flashabou material is key in my opinion. It creates that turquoise iridescent look that you see on most sunfish. So if you're not using dressed up trebles, I recommend for sure trying the flashabou or at least some feathered treble hooks out there that you can get at most retailers. It really makes a difference anytime you're using a topwater bait around bluegill beds. So a popper is one of my absolute favorite baits to go with. I also highly recommend using a prop bait. This is just a prop bait that's made to be twitched on the surface. Again, you know, I've dressed up the back treble hook here. This is a Brian's B prop bait, one of my favorites out there. There's a lot of really good ones on the market. All of these baits, you can click the link in the description of the video. It'll take you to a site to look at these baits in more close-up detail. But the prop bait does such a good job mimicking a bluegill again, because you have these blades that are spinning on the surface, creating little twitching motions, sputtering and spitting a little bit of water, which again does a very good job at mimicking a bluegill. When a bass sees a bluegill that's feeding on the surface, that is one of those peak times that the bass will take advantage to try to eat that bluegill. So a topwater does a great job at that. So if a bass sees a topwater sitting on the surface, they will mistake it for a bluegill, and that's oftentimes one of the baits that will get your bites. So if you're not catching them on a topwater bait, my next go-to bait is just going to be your weightless wacky stickworm. This is the Berkley Max Scent General, one of my absolute favorites. And I've got it paired here on a G Finesse weedless wacky bait by Gamakatsu. It's a really good combination. And I like to have that the weedless factor on this hook, because oftentimes, like I mentioned before, you're going to be fishing around those targets. So if you're throwing to a dock, or you're throwing to a piece of brush, or you've got some pads, if you're throwing just a normal wacky rig hook that's exposed, at that point you're probably going to get hung up. And a lot of times with these fish, that first cast is most important. If the bass becomes wary of its surroundings and sees you, generally speaking, they've become much harder to catch. So that first cast is really key. And because of that, that's why I like to go with a weedless wacky rig hook. It's important to me to make sure that wherever I throw this bait, I'm going to be able to get it back to the boat. One other key that I want to point out here that I do with my stickworms, and I almost always throw a green pumpkin color or a watermelon color, because in my opinion, it mimics the bluegill quite well. I like to take some chartreuse dye, and I dye the tip of the bait just to, again, give it that iridescent, almost turquoisey look. Like if you take green pumpkin and you dye the tip of it in chartreuse, it almost has that fluorescent green look, which again mimics a sunfish tail. So I think that's important as well. It seems to generate a few extra bites for me when I'm out on the water. Last bait that I really like to utilize around the bluegill beds is a swim jig. In this case, this is a Megabass one that comes with a blade on the back because I was fishing some off-colored water. So I like to have a little bit of flash, a little bit of vibration that will allow the bass to key in on my bait versus the hundreds of other bluegills that are in those areas. But the swim jig is really important because not only does it mimic the bluegill quite well, but if you're fishing in an area that has some weed growth or has a lot of wood, again, you're going to need a presentation that's a little bit more weedless, and that's where a swim jig comes into play. You can swim this through those areas, you can make it look like a bluegill, and you can generate those bites in areas where you may not be able to work a topwater or even a weedless wacky rig. So another key that I like to do with this is I like to rig a trailer on it that's a little bit bulkier. I don't necessarily like to throw a boot tail. I almost like to go with something more like a cross style bait or a creature style bait. In this case, this is a 3-inch Berkley Pit Boss, which gives the bait a little bit more bulk and a little bit more kicking motion, but it's compact. You know, if I were to put a larger boot tail swimmer on the back, it becomes a longer profile. I want a bulkier profile anytime I'm trying to mimic a bluegill. I think that's an important key to remember as well. But again, the choices are important, but one of the keys to catching bass on bluegill beds is to make sure that your initial presentations are made successfully. And what I mean by that is you want to make an accurate cast to where the bluegill beds are, to where those targets are that are surrounding the bluegill beds. And you don't want to make a lot of noise. You want to come in, make a cast from a long distance away. A lot of times you know those bluegill beds are already there. If you're practicing for a tournament and you've marked a pile of bluegill beds, make those initial casts from a long distance away. Because if they see you first, a lot of times that bite's not going to happen. If they don't know you're there, they will bite almost always on that initial cast. Thanks for joining us for today's episode on bluegill bed fishing. Guys, make sure you check out other episodes from Bass Fishing Declassified as well as Fish the Moment. I'm Matt Stefan. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next episode.